Okay, so let's start. So I'm Patrick. I want to talk about mobile web app development using jQTouch. So I want to start with this question, which you hear a lot, and honestly it's kind of annoying because it's one of those questions that people just ask, and they don't really have an answer for it. You know, it's just one of those things that people say. But for a second, let's just take that question seriously and think about what a good mobile strategy should be. So, one mobile strategy would be just have your website, right? And this is kind of like the give up option, right? You just have your desktop-oriented website. You don't really care about mobile clients, and that's that. And that can be okay because some smartphones, like the iPhone, have awesome browsers. So, they do a pretty good job in that case. Another scenario might be a website, like a desktop website, plus maybe some mobile style sheets that are optimized for, an iPhone client or an iPad client, and so on. You can make a native app version of your website for iPhone or Android. And this is a great option, but it can be expensive, so not everyone can do it. Sometimes you have to maybe choose one of those two platforms, iOS or Android. But again, not everyone has access to, the money and the time to kind of pull that off. So thinking about our strategy, when you want to have a mobile strategy, a good step is to optimize for mobile display. Mobile displays are smaller. They have less resolution. You want to make your pages load faster. You want to reduce your network traffic. So you want to try to look at, if you have a normal desktop web app page, it might be fairly complex. You might be downloading a couple megabytes of stuff. So you want to try to really simplify that. And you might want to support, touch gestures like scroll or tab, that sort of thing. So let's look at market share with smartphones in the US right now. This is current. This is like this past quarter. You can see that, BlackBerry RIM is the largest with 35%. The iPhone second with 28%. Windows 19%. Android is starting to catch up with 9%. And then there's some other ones as well. But more important than just raw market share, who's actually using the browsers on these phones? And that's when it gets kind of interesting. Because if you look at this, you go back to the previous one, it's very different. So, iOS users, iPhone users, are the dominant mobile browser users today. And that's basically because mobile Safari is awesome. So following that is Android, right? And then the other platforms kind of drop off. So for instance, BlackBerry has a very large install base in the previous slide, but not much web browser usage because they have a terrible web browser. And it's not something that a lot of BlackBerry users are really focused on. So what does this mean? So if we go back to our original options, there's really kind of a fourth option now that's kind of intriguing. And that is, doing a website and a mobile optimized web app. So not quite a native app, not quite a website, but something kind of in between. So that means that your mobile strategy is WebKit. If we go back to this slide, those first two, if you look at the top two mobile browser usage categories, it's iPhone and Android, and those are both WebKit-based browsers. So ultimately, what I think you should do is target browsers that people really use versus the ones that are on phones but don't get used much or do terrible jobs at rendering pages. So 81% of mobile browser traffic today on smartphones is using a WebKit-based browser. So that's iOS, so the iPhone, the iPod Touch, also the iPad, Android, WebOS, which Palm has recently been acquired by HP, but HP is looking to make tablets with WebOS, so that could be interesting. And supposedly BlackBerry is going to start using WebKit in some of its newer products. But inevitably, if you say, okay, 88% of this market, are using an awesome browser as their basis, people ask, okay, what about all these other browsers, on these different phones? So I think you ultimately have to say, just who cares, right? Like these browsers kind of suck. No one's going to really care. It's already bad. You really can't fix it as a website author. So I think a good strategy is to optimize for awesome phones. So that basically means phones that have WebKit. So WebKit's awesome. It supports web standards really well. That means you're going to get consistent rendering across all these different devices, for the most part. It's got support for HTML5. It's got animation. It's got transforms, transitions. You can do offline caching. There's a whole bunch of stuff that makes WebKit great. So that's where jQTouch comes in. jQTouch is basically a framework, really simple framework for building web apps on smartphones that have a native look and feel. So it's kind of a hybrid between just a simple website and a purely native app, like an iPhone app. But increasingly, that division between website and native app is kind of merging. So jQTouch is essentially jQuery plus some jQTouch libraries and just a simple web page. So to get started with jQTouch, you would just create a basic document, and you'd add in some JavaScript. So if you look at this, we're essentially loading jQuery from Google. We're loading the jQTouch library. We're importing some style sheets and some themes. And that's kind of all you need. So once you've got that in your JavaScript, you want to kind of invoke jQTouch, which I'm doing here. So I'm kind of setting some default options. I'm saying, okay, here's the icon for my app. I want the status bar to be black. I want to preload these images. This is just the way you kind of kick off everything. So once you've got that going in your web page, you start out, let's just say, with index.html. So very simple page. We've just got the body. And the way that jQTouch works is essentially it's got very simple markup you use that it then looks at and recognizes and creates a native look and feel, essentially, from that. So with our basic page that we've made, if I go back for a second, this page just has starting out, it's got a div called home, which is a class of current. So it's saying this is the current page we're on. There's a class called toolbar with the headline and the toolbar. And then right where my comment is, that's where the content's going to go. So if you look at this illustration, we're essentially, with jQTouch, loading one single page and then loading fragments of HTML into that page as we request them. So we're not loading, lots of pages over and over. We're not reloading, the same JavaScript libraries or assets or whatever. All right, so as a simple example, let's say I have, 3 different pages here that I want to show on my mobile web app that's using jQTouch. So that essentially means 3 different divs with unique IDs. So the first one is ID about. You can see that it has a toolbar and it says, about us. The next one's blog, and the last one is contact us. And I made a mistake on the last one, so the div ID for that really should be contact, so they remain unique. So the way that would work is, if I want to load the about page or the blog page or the contact page, I'd simply reference those snippets by linking, normally I would just say ahref equals pound about, pound blog, pound contact, and jQTouch will load these snippets and animate between them, and they'll appear to be different screens loading, but really it's just content being appended to the main document. But interestingly, if you look at the bottom, I've got sort of 4 example pages or sub-pages that I'm loading into this app. The 4th one has a different syntax, right? There's not a pound, there's a slash. So all that's saying is slash video, like load the video.html page, which itself is also just a div. So essentially what you can do is, if you wanted, you could build a very simple jQTouch app that can, a single page could contain all the pages in the app, if it's fairly simple. But what you might want to do is if you have a more complicated app that has sections of content, maybe you just take a section of content, like a blog or video or something really complex, and put all the content for that in a single page. But essentially, it just, you can have, a page can contain more than one page, essentially. So the other thing you're really doing with jQTouch is using sort of markup-based UI. So what that means is it expects a certain style of markup with a certain set of classes. And once you add those classes, you get nice sort of native behavior in your app. So that means things like toolbars, lists, buttons, forms, navigation. So with the toolbar, going back to my previous example, you can see there's a div here with a class of toolbar, and inside of that is a headline tag, which would be the headline that would appear on the toolbar. So I'm going to show you some examples in a second, so this will make a little bit more sense. But you can see how in these 3 different pages, I'm changing the toolbar text just by changing the headline. So pretty simple. And then as an example of a list, it's a straight up HTML list with some special classes, right? So I've got an unordered list element with a class of rounded. So not surprisingly, that's going to give you a list that has rounded corners and looks sort of like an iPhone style table view, if you're familiar with that. And then the individual list elements have a class of arrow, which means they're going to have sort of disclosure triangles on the far right, indicating that there's more content behind them. And you can see that I have essentially links for each list that link to these inline divs that jQTouch is going to treat as different pages. Okay, so those are some simple examples. I'm not going to kind of go super in depth on how to build stuff with jQTouch because I think it's pretty straightforward. But I'm going to show you some basic UI stuff just so you can get a sense of the possibilities of what you can do with jQTouch. And then I'll also show you an app that I built pretty rapidly. All right, so here's my trusty iPhone simulator. If you're not familiar with this, if you install the iOS SDK that Apple has, this comes with it. It's pretty nice. It basically gives you kind of a emulated, iPhone. So I've got Safari, and this is kind of the jQTouch demo page. It's a little bit dark for people watching here, but this is essentially a demo of different types of user interface elements.
What's this right here again?
This thing here? So that's the iPhone simulator, and that's part of the iPhone SDK. Right, so this is what a lot of iPhone developers use to test their app.
You're just running Safari.
Yeah, so I'm running mobile Safari on that. So if I click the home button, right, it's just got a few apps. So normally if I was building a native iPhone app, I would build my app and it would be installed in the simulator and I could play around with it. But in this case, I'm just using mobile Safari that's already built in. And in particular, I've just gone to the jQTouch website to look at this demo. So this is running straight off of their website. And like I said, it's a little bit dark, but essentially this has a lot of kind of iPhone-style behaviors. So we have lists, different style of lists, right? So this is more like a list in your address book or contacts on your phone, where the list element goes completely across the screen. So that's edge to edge. There's one called plastic, which has kind of a different look and feel. So you can see up top too, we've got the toolbar, which is I was referring to earlier. And we've got some buttons here, so the buttons provide navigation within the app, kind of going back and forward. It's got some basic forms, right? So if you have a text field here, or search field, phone field, so on. Some form buttons. So if you notice, as we're navigating through this, it's animating these pages in a very similar fashion to the way a lot of basic iPhone apps in particular work. Right? So we're starting on here. We're selecting this list. It's loading up the next kind of page snippet. It's updating the title. It's animating. And I can kind of dig in, and then there's a back button here that takes me back, and so on. So these are some of the animations you can do. You can kind of, slide up, slide down, dissolve in. So depending on what you're doing in your app, these could be nice for transitions. So there's support for AJAX stuff, which is kind of nice. So I'll show you a bit more in a second. This is a floaty bar extension, which is kind of silly, but it'll kind of float down as you scroll the content. All right, so that's the basic demo of some of the UI stuff. I recommend checking it out in person. Again, it's a little bit dark here, so I'm sort of pointing at nothing, and you're like, oh yeah, what is that? Yeah. So let me skip ahead to an app that I built for a client, just to show you some of the stuff we can do. So this particular app was built for BMI, which is a big kind of music rights organization. So they have a pretty big site, a lot of content, and what they wanted to do was to kind of simplify all that content, provide some of the best content that they have for kind of a mobile experience. And this was one of those like, okay, you've got to build this thing in 2 weeks sort of apps. It really took about 10 days, start to finish. I'd never used jQTouch at all. So it's pretty cool what you can do. So in this case, this is kind of the first view that you see. So we've just got kind of some basic content here. We have a couple articles. So I can just click on one of these, and it's going to load up the article. It's got an image. I can kind of scroll through here and check everything out. Right, so that makes sense. Then there's a menu that we made for this app. Since this client has a lot of content, so we definitely have sections of content that are fairly deep. So we sort of wanted to do this menu that's always available, this button here. So you click the menu, and then you can sort of start going through the content. So here is some more news about their various artists. So kind of nice. You can see for this app, jQTouch ships with two different themes. One's kind of a really dark theme. One is a more standard-looking Apple theme that's more grays and blues, and it's kind of what you're seeing here. But going back to this news example, all right, so I'm looking at some articles. I load 10 up here, which is a good number for a mobile experience, right? You don't want to load 100 or 200. You want just enough to get started. And much like a lot of native iPhone apps, you can keep paginating through the content just by loading 10 more articles at a time.
Which is the Rails app in the back?
It's not, actually. And that's one interesting point to make about jQTouch, is there's no real dependency there. I mean, this site is a PHP site, right? I mean, you really just need web pages. So however you want to generate those. And I think this would be a great match for Sinatra, right? You kind of probably have really simple routes for this, which makes sense. But you can certainly use this with Rails as well.
Are you repurposing? I mean, how did you get their basic stripped down content? Like stripped of all the. Are you grabbing their exact same URL and taking a style sheet and adding your own style sheet? Or?
So, in some cases, like what we did is, they have sort of a big PHP-based CMS behind the scenes. So, in some cases, what I did is just create new templates, where you take a typical page they have and just make a simpler template that's optimized for jQTouch. So that's basically what we did. It's on the web. And one thing to point out, I think when you're optimizing for a mobile client, the use case is not necessarily someone's on their phone and they're in the middle of Kansas and they're only getting Edge. In that scenario, it's probably going to suck. A lot of this is just like, this site probably works best on Wi-Fi. But still, if it's in your hand, you want that optimized experience where the content's larger and it's easier to kind of, scroll through. Currently, there's not. So I think what the choice they made seems to be that, in terms of best look and feel, for the most part, iPhone is where it's at right now. But the interesting thing is that this renders exactly the same on Android, which.
Here, you can sort of very consistent experience, but if I were to render that on one, it would be very jarring because the navigation on Android is
Yeah, well, I think they would benefit from having a more Android-specific style, but I've tested this quite a bit on Android phones, and I'm not a day-to-day Android user, so maybe I'm not as sensitive to that. But I think it's pretty acceptable. I mean, certainly better than just the desktop site scaled down. Right?
Well, we just raised like $10 million or something, right? So I'm sure.
Yeah, I'll get to that near the end. So just to kind of go through this to show you some more examples of content. This is pretty deep, so this is like an example of a rounded list that I was building earlier with an arrow class, right? So we're using the arrow to indicate there's a lot more to this page, right? So a lot more articles here. Again, the same kind of pagination style. And this is actually an Ajax call, right? So we're saying, all right, go and give us 10 more articles and append them to this document. And this is kind of cool. This is a list of their offices around the world. So there's like a little, embedded map. You can actually, try to call the office. It's not going to work in the simulator, but pretty cool. So the actual content of the site probably is not going to be interesting to you, but there's just a lot of stuff there. So it's kind of an interesting challenge to get this all going.
Where was the map?
Where was what?
Where was the map? The map page you were on?
That's just using like the Google Maps API.
Where is it in the app?
Where is it?
How do you get to it? I didn't see what you clicked to get to that map.
Oh, you didn't see it? That's creators, BMI offices. And then you get a choice. So one of the coolest parts of the site is video. So the video is presented sort of this article style, right? So you kind of see the headline and an image. And then we click on this. And this might not work in the simulator. I don't know if I've really tried it here. Originally it did, but I don't think it does now because of the way we're doing video. But you get a still, with the normal like kind of play button. You hit the video, and then from that point on, it's behaving normally. It's like being thrown out to the YouTube player or the embedded player. Really kind of cool.
Does that work on Android, I think?
I think it does, yeah. Yeah, I think originally, we have a lot of different video formats, but I think all the stuff we have on this now, it's all on YouTube, so it just does the right thing. No, essentially at that point, it's just the default browser handling of that stuff. So one thing to point out, too, that I did for this menu is I used some sweet icons from the Glyphish site. If you're familiar with it, they provide a lot of free icons for native iPhone apps. But they can be used very nicely for this sort of thing, this menu, or even for like a desktop web app, it can be cool. This site? Or the Glyphish? Yeah, it's GLYPHISH.com. All right, so that's kind of it for my demo. Got a couple other points to make here. So, debugging obviously is a concern. There are a couple ways to handle that. I just showed you one of them, the iPhone simulator. There's, of course, an Android simulator, which I did use when I was developing this. So you need to download the Android SDK, build an image of which phone you want to, target. I recommend, targeting like 2 and above. But I've tried this like on Android 1.5, and it still was looking pretty good. And then, of course, if you have actual devices, that's obviously best. I spent a lot of time just my personal iPhone testing this, but I would borrow friends' Androids or Palms. I think I tested this on like 4 or 5 different devices.
You can just test it with that on Safari too.
That's true. If for a lot of like just real quick development, I would be doing that. You can enable the developer menu and switch your user agent to be mobile Safari. So that was pretty useful. So something else to think about is, if you build a mobile web app using jQTouch, you want to get people to it. So you want to kind of detect the browsers you're supporting and then redirect appropriately. That's not something that jQTouch does out of the box. At the simplest, you do something like this. You just say, all right, let's look at the user agent string. Let's try to match on Android, WebOS, iPhone, iPod. You'll notice there's not iPad there. Certainly you could try to do that, but really the iPad is big enough where it can display a normal site pretty well. So I don't think this is really optimal for that. So essentially we're just detecting the clients we're supporting that support WebKit, and then redirecting, in this case, to a directory where our jQTouch app is. This sort of thing, though, is, I think, pretty specific to a given site. So this is just an example, but your needs probably would vary greatly. But you could use this as a good starting point. So another thing to think about is like version switching, right? So that's basically which version do you want? So you're maybe using the mobile client, but do you get the mobile version or the desktop version? And you want to give users the ability to switch between each one seamlessly. And that's a very simple concept, but the execution of it is tricky because you're sort of setting cookies saying, okay, like this is a mobile client, but they specifically said, I don't want the mobile version, I want the desktop version. And so there's some tricky logic there to get that going, but it's something you probably want to do if it's an app people are going to care about. And another cool thing that we did, which kind of gets back to your question about some of the content, getting it super optimized for a mobile device. jQTouch is built on top of jQuery, so theoretically you still have access to the power of jQuery. So don't be afraid to use that. So in this code block here, I'm looking for pages that get loaded, and I'm disabling links in paragraphs. And so the reasoning behind that might be, if you're making a mobile web app, you might just want a portion of your content available in that app, which means you don't want every single link in your entire site necessarily to work. And so if you have content that you can't easily transform, you could theoretically transform it using jQuery dynamically. So it's kind of a cool technique, and we use this quite a bit on this app. So lastly, some resources. jQTouch.com, of course, the home base for jQTouch. Recently, they moved over from Google Code to GitHub, which is, I think, a great improvement. So that's the new home for the raw source code. Peepcode has an excellent video on jQTouch. I would not have been able to do this project without it. It's worth buying. It's about an hour. It's really informative. And then the site with the cool icons is glyphish.com, like I was saying. And then coming soon, interestingly, like just after I finished this app, there was an announcement about Sencha. So Sencha is basically a merging of EXT.js, jQTouch, and Raphael. Not necessarily the code bases, but all the people behind that are kind of coming together under one company, and they're trying to build sort of a really forward-thinking framework for mobile web apps. So I think it's really, really promising. It's probably a little bit early to say, go build your app on this right now, because this just came out like, I don't know, a week or two ago. But it looks cool. And you can see that they're not just targeting iPhones and Android phones, but also iPad apps. So, web-based iPad apps. Really kind of cool. As well, jQTouch will still be around, so there's a new roadmap for that. There's a new maintainer. So I think it's got some promise. Mainly what I wanted to do with this talk was just show you that I think we're at this interesting fork in the road where web apps on mobile phones don't have to suck, and they can actually be really cool and really feel native, especially because JavaScript performance has improved so greatly that you get awesome animations and that sort of thing. So you really can make awesome, optimized, sort of mobile experiences without a huge amount of pain, without having to like write your own framework and test things everywhere. So that's it.
And you could theoretically wrap that whole thing up and make a native app, right? With some tools.
That's true. Yeah, I think PhoneGap maybe supports that. So kind of cool.
Browser, but go
Right.
to the URL.
Yeah.
You can also do use the like online web app support in Safari and specify so that if someone bookmarks looking at an ad home screen on that that it'll get like the Chrome.
Yeah, that's one thing I meant to show you guys actually in the simulator. So if I bookmark the BMI app, add to the home screen, jQTouch has support for like a custom touch icon and also a custom startup screen. So basically, there's a convention, like Apple expects that the touch icon have a certain size, and then same thing for the startup image. And so in jQTouch, you just set it in the.
Doing it by hand with the link tag.
Yeah, there's a certain format, but with jQTouch, just in this configuration block, you can set the icon here, and then you can. I didn't do all the options. There are a lot of them, but it's definitely possible. Cool. Any other questions? All right.